In continuing our discussion of the origins of the Cold War for AQA A Level History, what I want to do in this video is talk about the growing involvement of the United States in Europe. This involves looking at a number of specific issues: the policy towards Britain and Europe, the relationship and the strategic importance of Great Britain during this time, the launch of the Marshall Plan, and then US attitudes towards Germany and Berlin. Now, fundamentally then, we can see that ultimately the United States goes through, in a relatively short period of time, a policy of isolationism to interventionism. So in 1941, before they are formally thrust into the Second World War with the attack on Pearl Harbor at the end of that year, the US is embracing a policy of isolationism, essentially. They are providing quite a lot of financial aid to Great Britain at the time, but for the most part are remaining neutral in this conflict, the conflict being the Second World War. And then from 1941 onwards, we see the United States deeply involved in European politics, European affairs, and essentially contributing to the returning of occupied territory by the Third Reich back to people who rightfully owned it. Now, they continued this policy of interventionism and being very deeply and intimately involved in European politics. This continues post-1945 and essentially has continued all the way up until the Trump administration in the last few months or so. And so, ultimately, let's talk about some of the issues that are associated with the growing US involvement in Europe, specifically with reference to 1945 to 1949. And the specification begins by thinking about the policy towards Britain and Europe. Now, after World War II, the United States did see herself as a global leader responsible for the preventing of future conflicts. This marks a very important shift, as we've already mentioned, from pre-World War II isolationism. And Great Britain was seen as a very important strategic ally during this period. So Britain was a strategic ally during the Second World War and also after the Second World War. The US was deeply concerned about its survival as a global power. However, Britain's economy was devastated by the war and had started to face quite severe balance of payments problems. For those of you who want to know a little bit more about this, and if you're generally interested, we have a series of lessons on the making of modern Britain. It is a module for the AQA specification that you would not be doing if you were doing this module, but it might be interesting if you want to know a bit more about specifically British economy between specifically 1951 to 1964. But ultimately, the US saw Britain as an important partner in the fight against Soviet expansion. And so despite financial difficulties, the US was committed to maintaining strong Anglo-American relations. Britain's economic difficulties led to a divergence in the post-war years, and you also have to remember that Great Britain and the United States' strategic alliances and ideological principles did wane at times and did stretch at times, particularly when we think about the declining issues of Great Britain's empire, the British Empire, the process of decolonization in places like India and in the Middle East in the 1940s, and then things like, for example, the Suez Crisis in 1956, which definitely saw Great Britain and the United States butt heads quite significantly. But the whole policy we tend to see a major shift from isolationism to interventionism. The Truman Doctrine in March 1947 articulated the fundamental shift in this foreign policy. It was a response to the Soviet Union's expansion in Eastern Europe, particularly attacks on Greece and Turkey, where communist insurgencies were threatening to topple these governments. We spoke about the Greek Civil War in the previous lesson. The US essentially promised then financial and military support to the countries that were resisting communism. The doctrine was marked by the beginning of the US policy of containment, which sought to stop the spread of communism on a global scale. And we see this with two major issues, with the Berlin Crisis and the Berlin Airlift, which we'll get to in a second. We'll get to the Marshall Plan as well. And fundamentally then, what one of the first US policies was, one of the first sort of moves the United States makes in relation to Europe and in relation to its intervention in Europe post the Second World War, is the launch of the Marshall Plan, officially titled the European Recovery Program. It was one of the most significant parts of US policy. It was launched in June 1947 by Secretary of State George C. Marshall, hence the name. And it aimed to provide economic aid and rebuild European economies after World War II. Now, ultimately, there are key objectives and motivations that are associated with the Marshall Plan. The more pessimistic historian might say that the Marshall Plan was clearly just an example of economic imperialism, and it was clearly just an example of bringing these European economies into the sphere of influence of the United States, and they had the Cold War in the back of their mind for the entire period. Now, that is definitely one of the reasons why the Marshall Plan is launched, but George C. Marshall himself visited Europe just before the launching of the Marshall Plan and saw just how dire the situation was, how much devastation there was, and how dire the need for reconstruction was. The United States more broadly believed that economic instability would make countries vulnerable to both communist influence, but also would make things more vulnerable to the potential outbreak of further conflict. So that's one of the reasons why we see the Marshall Plan be implemented. The pessimistic reason is, of course, that it was a key tool in the US strategy of containment. By revitalizing European economies, this might hopefully reduce the appeal of communism. So if the economies were destroyed and completely unable to recover, then the idea of communist ideas might start to gain ground. There were definitely strong communist parties in France and in Italy, for example. But for the most part, then, when we think about the Marshall Plan, you can sort of take the more pessimistic motivations, but there were also motivations of genuinely wanting to see economic recovery. George C. Marshall himself made that very, very clear, even if the underlying reasons for the Marshall Plan were a little bit more pessimistic. But the implementation and its impact was very successful. Between 1948 and 1952, the US provided over $13 billion in economic assistance across to 16 different European countries. European countries including Britain, France, West Germany, and Italy. Now, this $13 billion in between those two dates, 48 to 52, would approximately be around $130 billion in aid if we were talking about today's money. The aid was used to rebuild infrastructure, industries, and to boost agricultural production. It was therefore highly successful. European economies began to rapidly recover and industrial production began to soar. In West Germany, for example, you have what is known as the economic miracle, partially caused by the Marshall Plan. If you want to know more about the economic miracle, we have some lessons on the module for AQA A Level History on Germany between 1871 and 1991. Again, if you're doing this module on the Cold War, you won't be doing that module because you won't be allowed to, but if you want to have a look, those videos are available there as well, the idea of the economic miracle. By 1952 then, industrial production in the participating countries had returned to pre-war levels, and gross domestic product, GDP, had grown in France, for example, by about 22%, while in Italy it had grown by as much as 27% between 1948 and 1952. That's a major economic recovery, which is marked as a success for the Marshall Plan. Now, the Soviets' reaction to the Marshall Plan was, of course, not as positive as the people who were the recipients of the Marshall Plan. The Soviet Union and its satellite states, for example, rejected the Marshall Plan. They saw it as a form of American economic imperialism. And so instead, the Soviets pressured Eastern Bloc countries to also avoid accepting US aid, and in response to the Marshall Plan in 1949, the Soviet Union formed the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon, in 1949, as I've just mentioned, to coordinate economic activities within the Eastern Bloc and to try and basically do their own Marshall Plan, their own Soviet Eastern version of the Marshall Plan, to reduce and to counter the influence of the United States. We will get to looking at the impact of and the control and conflict over Germany in the next lesson, but I just want to just very quickly look at some of the issues associated with Berlin and Germany at the moment, just in terms of some of the divisions that we see. So immediately after the end of the Second World War, Germany is divided into two major occupation zones, but of that, actually 4 occupation zones. You have the United States, Great Britain, and France occupying one side, and the Soviet Union occupying the other. So these were each administered by each of these different Allied countries. Berlin was also divided into those same 4 sections in a similar way, despite the fact that Berlin was located in the Soviet zone of occupation. So Berlin, for those of you who don't know, for a basic geography lesson, is more towards the east side of Germany, and so therefore it firmly sat inside the eastern side of the German state. But for the entirety of the Cold War, even when the two countries were split into two, we can see that there is still an influence and there is still a presence of the Allied forces in Berlin. This is one of the reasons why we see the rising of the Berlin Wall as well later on, which we'll get to. So there were differing objectives then between the Allied forces when it came to the division of Germany. On the one hand, the US, Britain and France initially sought to rebuild Germany as a democratic and capitalist state. But on the other hand, the Soviet Union, for probably understandable reasons, didn't want to see the state of Germany have any kind of control or authority. And so they sought to establish a socialist government in its zone and to try and extract reparations from Germany to try and repay for the destruction that was caused by the Second World War. In 1948, then, we see a Soviet blockade. We see the Soviet Union essentially blockaded West Berlin in an attempt to force the Western Allies out of the city. The US and its allies responded with what was known as the Berlin Airlift, organising the largest humanitarian operation in history to supply the city by air. This was a major confrontation in the early stage of the Cold War, and something that we will get to in the next lesson and think about in more detail. But just as a bit of statistical analysis to show just how impressive the Berlin Airlift was, US and British Air Forces flew nearly 200,000 flights and delivered nearly 2.5 million tons of fuel, food and supplies to West Berlin, ensuring that the city had survived. But also, we saw flights landing and taking off every few minutes for the entirety of the period of the Berlin blockade and the airlift operation. But it was clearly a very important signal that there was clearly ideological division starting to take shape between the East and West, between the US and the Soviet Union. And by 1949, in May 1949 specifically, we see the US, Britain and France combine their zones together, their occupation zones, to create West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. This would be a country with a capitalist and a democratic government. In response, the Soviet Union establishes in October 1949 the German Democratic Republic. This is the East German state, which is a communist state. And ultimately, we see then the Cold War divisions start to take shape. The division of Germany into East and West becomes a symbol of the broader division of Europe during the Cold War. And that's one of the reasons why we're going to spend an entire lesson in the next video talking about specifically Germany. We'll talk about this in way more detail, the blockade, the airlift, and the eventual creation of these two states, as well as the formation of NATO.